Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. So I can start? Okay, cool. So yes, welcome everybody. Pretty short about me because I'm not the interesting part of this, NixOS. But I'm Bryan. I'm a software engineer at Tweak. I focus primarily on developer productivity these days. That's why I do presentations as well these days. And I will be talking about Nix. Now, fair warning in advance, I will be making a few assumptions. One of those is pretty controversial and within the community if you're a Nix. I will assume Flakes is a thing. I will use Flakes. Why? Because I personally believe it's the future. That's about it. Personal opinion, not sponsored by my employer, kind of sponsored by my employer. Just so you know. Also, if I say something wrong and you're sure that I said something wrong or you believe I said something wrong, please interrupt me. If you have questions, please interrupt me. I do prefer a communicative style of presentations. So, why do we Nix? Well, it's a pretty difficult question to answer, so I'm not going to answer this for everybody in the community, because a lot of people that I've talked to within the Nix community have a different reason of finding out about it, starting to use it, actually keep using it, etc. But I can tell you why I use it personally and how I got into the Nix community and the Nix world. So I used to use Arch, by the way, has become a catchphrase since config management camp that I thought up on the spot, but yeah, I used to use Arch. And besides Arch, I used a lot of different tools, and managing those tools on my personal laptop became a real hassle, became a problem, became difficult. Making sure that those tools synced up with the rest of the team also became a hassle. Apart from that, I also did embedded development, so a lot of kernel patching, kernel hacking, and my personal laptop, of course, was the perfect test subject for all of these things, so it would catch fire from time to time pretty often. I found out about Nix and NixOS, and it promises me to have a system that cannot break. I was like, great, that sounds cool, let's test it out. So I start testing it out. I still do embedded development, and it still breaks, of course. I mean, Nix doesn't magically solve that problem. It isn't a be-all, end-all solution for all of your problems with Linux and all of these tools. But it does give you a nice superpower, and that's the capability of just rolling back time. I made some changes to my system breaks, I roll back, system's fixed again. Back to the old state, I can just continue my work without figuring out why it broke. These tools on the left hand as well, it became nice because now I had a tool to encapsulate all of those things and ship them over to my colleagues, and also have my colleagues use the exact same tools without any problems. That's why I use Nix. I've heard other people use it because it solves the package management issue, it solves the configuration issue, it solves reproducibility, sort of, kind of. It does a lot of things, and that makes it difficult to explain why people use it. This is my story. Ask Nixers why they started using Nix. It's always a nice conversation. But I can explain you what Nix is, right? Nix is, in essence, in my opinion, an ID. But people started overloading the term to also make it mean that's a complete functional programming language, that it's a complete package manager, that it's a complete package set, and that it's a complete operating system, that it's a complete deployment tool, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of things that people use the name Nix for. So I'm going to explain you what it does, and I'm going to show you a few examples of how it's used. So one of the primary IDs that Nix has, is this large enough? It has to be, I'm sorry. But one of the nice things or one of the core IDs that Nix has is, well, instead of just installing things on your system, right? If you do sudo apt install a program, it just goes into your system, somewhere on the system, God knows where, right? Nix throws that entire idea out of the window, and it says, no, when we install software, we're not just going to install it somewhere on the system, no, we're going to install it in what we call the Nix store, /Nix on the system, and that's where software is going to live. That's the first ID. Second ID, well, okay, software has a place to live now. So now we're also going to make sure that multiple versions of the same software can coexist on the same system. Well, how do we do that? Well, we prefix everything in that Nix store by a certain hash, and that hash is determined by the inputs of how the software was built. I'll come back on that later, but just so you know that is something in the Nix store. How do we get things in the Nix store? Well, we have our programming language, and maybe soon one of my colleagues is working on experimental Python bindings for Nix, which will be pretty cool, but it's not there yet. Right now we use Nix as a language. That's also what I'll be assuming for this talk. But just know that if you're interested in using Nix, but not in using Nix the language, which I can understand, Python by Nix may soon be in the experimental phase so that you can actually test it out and use it. But so with Nix as a language, we can then talk to Nix as a store that will then eventually talk to our operating system or file system, whether get things in and out of the file system and get things in and out of the Nix store. So that's what Nix does conceptually. Well, that's cool. We now have things in the Nix store, but we still cannot access them, right? I mean, sure, you could type /nix hash of how many characters wide? 63 or something like that. It's a few characters wide, right? And then the name and then the version of the software /bin /your executable. That's not fun. So what we have instead is profiles. And what are profiles? Something else in the Nix store. In the sense that if you look over here, we see /nix /var/nix profiles and /nix store. Well, a profile is nothing more but yet another package, so to speak, yet another software component in the Nix store that's symlinked eventually into somewhere else in the Nix, not store, but Nix says var/nix. And that then eventually is symlinked into your user directories. Why do we do it this way? We could manipulate path. The path variable. Problem of manipulating the path like this, of the path variable rather, is that if we manipulate it, we'd have to restart the session. With just symlinking things and making sure the path points into those symlink directories, we actually can, at runtime so to speak, change all of these things. It's pretty nice. So we have the idea of profiles. What are profiles? Collections of software packages that then eventually link back into your user directory. Yes?
Just with you, before you said we're using Nix as a language, does that mean that technically this whole system could run on like an Arch installation?
Yeah.
Like as a bottom. So the Nix store is like completely separate from...
Completely separated, yeah. So we have, and this is something that I'll come back to in a bit as well, but I'll explain right now. The name is quite overloaded. So there's like Nix as a language and the package manager. Those two are more often and not always used together, right? And then there's NixOS. Yeah. And NixOS, you don't have to use NixOS to use Nix as a package manager. There's even this fun party trick that Matthew Krogan always showed me rather. It's like, get an Arch user, right? Install Nix on their system, then remove Pacman from their system, and then install Pacman again through Nix. That's perfectly possible. So yeah, it can coexist with other systems. No, but it can coexist, yeah. So what is Nix? Well, I always say it's complicated, because explaining this really is like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the package manager? Are we talking about the operating system, the language? Again, I'm talking primarily about the package manager and the language right now. Out of this entire discussion, eventually, what is Nix, came the holy triangle, I call it. Well, Nix is the language, and it is the operating system, and it is the package manager, but it is, the package manager is not the language, and the language is not yours, and it keeps on going. And in my opinion, there's even a missing set, the Nix packages itself, like one of the more important parts of Nix. Well, how does that fit in? So that entire discussion becomes very complicated very quickly. So again, if you talk to somebody in the Nix community, or they're trying to sell you Nix rather, ask them, what exactly are you talking about, and which part of Nix are you talking about, right? And also explain to them what part you're interested in. The logo is also used everywhere. So the operating system and the package manager and the language all share the same logo. And we even started using the logo for the conferences and the user groups. So if you see this snowflake with fancy lambdas because it's functional, we're talking about Nix. So onto our first real concrete thing, the package manager itself. So in hindsight, it doesn't really do anything different than other package managers. Yes, I'm showing you the imperative way. A good colleague of mine at Tweak would murder me for showing you this way of installing packages in Nix, but it's, in my opinion, a good gateway drug into getting you to understand what it actually does. In hindsight, it doesn't do anything different. I install Cosay with app, I install Cosay with Nix. Well, the Nix one looks a bit bigger because there's this profile keyword in there. But that's about it, nothing really changes. I still install software. What does change, however, is if you note, in one hand, I have to do it with escalated privileges. Nix We recommend people to install Nix in a multi-user mode, like we call it, which means that there is a Nix daemon running as a root somewhere on your system that then communicates with the, Nix CLI talks with that daemon to install software actually. So it's kind of nice because now you no longer have to use root. You don't have to escalate your privileges anymore. We also install it in a profile. We could install it in a profile for my user, for your user, for an entire different ID of what your profile might be. So that's also pretty nice. You can also seamlessly switch between these profiles. There's no problem in doing that. And also, which in my opinion is pretty nice, we explicitly say where this package is coming from. In this case, it's saying Nix packages. But if I have my own repository with my own version of Cause, there's nothing stopping me from just referring to that repository instead of Nix packages. I'll show it a bit later, but Nix packages is nothing more than a GitHub repository in theory. There's some binary caching involved as well, but that's implementation detail. But it can also do some tricks, right? So something I cannot do with apt is make, of course I'm forgetting the word right now, ephemeral shells, I guess. Shells that I can just throw away. Like I want to try out a certain piece of software, but afterwards I don't care about it anymore. Well, I'm an Emacs user, I'm not a Vim user, so I'm going to touch this unholy command right now, Vim. My system is of course going to say it's not found, right? I don't have Vim installed whatsoever. I type Nix shell, not Nix profile install, but just Nix shell. Nix packages Vim, that does some sting, that does some stuff, and then all of a sudden I have Vim. Now if I type exit and I type Vim again, that's going to be gone. So now I have a very nice tool to just try out things, right? I want to try out a package. I don't want to install it just yet. I just want to try it out. Nix also has this Nix run. Yes?
In this case, what if Vim needs a certain compiler, for example, to compile code? Does it use the compiler already on your system, or is it, because it's part of the shell, is it completely separate and you need to install a compiler into that shell too?
Because the way that Nix packages software, right? Do you know what the term closure means? Imagine closure as the entire dependency graph of everything you need to build that single piece of software, right? So when I ask Nix to install Vim, right, it's basically trying to pull in that entire closure. And that's declared in Nix packages, right? Like that entire build graph is declared in Nix packages. I can override that compiler, but that would result in another version of Vim. That would result in, Nix doesn't see those as the same thing, right? So if you ask Nix for Vim compiled with LLVM, for example, and Vim compiled with GCC, those would be two completely different Vims in Nix's eyes.
What I'm specifically referring to is, say you want to compile code in Vim using Clang, for example, and Clang is already installed on your system.
No.
Can this connect to Clang on your system, or?
I guess you can do it in some hacky way, but the best thing that you can then probably do is use like the expansion syntax of Bash and include LLVM with this as well, and then you'll pull in
it should work, right?
Clang.
You have LLVM installed, you get a Nix profile install of.
We do some binary hackery in the search path. So
if it's in the search path, then
if it's in the search path, then probably yes. To be completely honest, I've been using NixOS for the past 4 or 5 years now, so I honestly don't know. I challenge you to try it out, right? If somebody's using a non-NixOS system, install Nix and try and compile things through Vim. That's the best way to figure it out, I guess.
But doesn't that whole dependency system also make it very slow to install packages? And like a lot of redundancy, because you pull so many different things?
First time install, yes. After that, it's okay, really.
Because it's cached.
Yeah. Also, there's this thing called what we call Hydra, which is like our CI service that does tests the entirety of Nix packages. All of those binary results we also cache, so you're never going to compile things, almost never going to compile things from source. If you're crazy like me and you decide to patch Emacs because there's a certain thing that doesn't exactly work like you want it to, then yes, that'll compile from source. But otherwise, I'll just fetch it from Hydra.
To be sure that because it's a duplication, if you have two packages that have the same compiler, that have the same dependency, you don't have that same dependency twice. That's
yeah.
duplicated.
Okay, but even if you have like two dependencies that are different versions, but they could technically like be used, like only one of them could be used for both ends, you will have two different versions.
Yes, but in practice you refer to Nix packages, which has one thing is latest GCC, and almost everyone uses that unless they have a very specific reason.
Yeah, exactly. But so, nice way to try software out, right? There's a shorter way to do it with Nix run. Instead of Nix shell, we can just do Nix run, it runs it, and that also, if I now type vim, it's still going to say vim not found. Now, imagine that I want to contribute to a package, right? This is, in my opinion, also kind of a superpower of Nix. I can say Nix develop Nix packages vim, right? And that's going to give me a shell that doesn't have vim installed, right? So if I type vim right now, it's still going to say, well, it's not found. Unpack phase is a function defined by the Nix standard environment and its builder environment. So this basically pulls in the source of vim. That's all it does, really. Vim's still not found, but now I can make a make test, and tada, I have vim installed. I can make my changes, I can commit back to upstream, and I can throw away this entire shell afterwards. If you combine this with make temp-d, pretty nice if you ask me. And then after all of that I'm done, I call nixstore.gc, and it's actually going to clean up all of the things that I no longer use, right? All of the things that I'm not actively referring to in my profile. All of the things that are not, what garbage collected roots, or they call it?
GC roots?
GC roots, yeah. All of the things that Nix determines that can be thrown away, it'll throw away in this stage, basically. So that's what Nix as a package manager offers you. It doesn't just give you the ability to install software, no, it takes us a step further, and it gives you the ability to install it, test it out, run it without actually, it does install it, but through a shell it's kind of invisible, and also gives you the ability to contribute and get development shells pretty easily. Then we have Nix as a language, and I'm going to skip over this pretty fast because it's a programming language. I hate it when people say it's the language, it's the programming language, because it really is a full programming language, right? We have functions, we have parameters, we have functions that are getting called within functions, we are getting return values, we have lists, we have sets, we have a whole lot of things. We can really do a lot with the language itself. I recently had a call with my Hive supporter at Tweak, Theophan, and he figured out to do impure stuff in the pure shell, which means that you can really abuse the language itself, which is not nice, but you can do it. So the language, it is what it is. It looks weird at first, but when you learn to read it, it's pretty okay. In this case, everything between these brackets is like we're defining a set, right? Then we have this column, and we're saying like, start a function over here. So everything on the left side is the parameters to the function, and then everything below that is basically the body of that function. So over here, I am passing a set of containing packages, Nix packages, and my list. And then from the packages attribute that I'm passing in here, I am then calling the lib attribute, and then calling the reverse list attribute, which just so happens to be a function. And I am I'm applying my list to that function. So these entire two lines define a function, basically, and I assign it to the name fun. Then I call fun with, packages equals packages, because I still have to tell it where it can find that attribute set. And then I say, my list is 1, 2, 3, and long and behold, what does it do? Well, it reverses it, so 3, 2, 1 comes out. So it's really a programming language. For being a language intended to be focused on packaging, it doesn't really have an idea of a package, but we get pretty close in the sense that we still define a function. So every single package within Nix is a function that takes parameters, right? Has a body being the things that it has to do to actually build the package, and it has an output. How do we get the hash of a Nix package? Well, it's because of the input attributes and the build steps that we take. If we change anything within the build steps or the input parameters, the entire hash changes. So we can almost always backtrack how a package was built, which is pretty nice. So in this case, we are trying to define how we built Vim, I guess. Yes, right? So we define a function with lib and fetch from GitHub. These are functions that are coming from Nix packages. We are defining a recursive set. So in this case, we are returning a recursive set. So, again, function, left side parameters, all the rest is the return body. So a recursive set. Why a recursive set? So that at a certain point I can call version over here. That's really the only reason. And what do? Well, I define another attribute set, being the version of Vim that I want to build. I define the source, where it can get it from. Nix packages gives me a nice utility function, fetch from GitHub, which will actually get all of these nice things from GitHub. A good thing to note is I always have to really define the hash. I always have to define like the sources that I pull in, what am I getting? That I always have to tell Nix this. If I don't do this, there's still a way to build it, but then it's impure. Then it's no longer pure. Then I set some flags, and in this sense, like hardening disabled. The standard environment of Nix by default sets certain C flags to hardening, security-wise, to just avoid certain bugs. But of course, you can override them, post-patch, etc. And then after this, when I run this, it'll actually go out. When I do call package, it'll go out, build the entire thing, which is pretty nice. So in a few lines of code, I have defined not only how I build something, right, but also where it can get it, how it should build it. In this case, it's going to go to the standard environment, which is basically doing a configure, make, and make install. Or not make install, but like copy the binaries into the Nix to a certain path and eventually end up in the Nix store. But I hope you realize how valuable this is. If I compare this to apt, for example, which I'm basically just pulling in binary blobs, with Nix I'm still pulling in binary. Sure, that's fair, but I can always go check how it built it. And I can even verify myself, well, if I call this package now and build it, do I actually get the same output? With apt, sure, I can do that. And then this is, by the way, not to throw shade at people that use apt or npm or whatever, it's just the way that it's done, right? With Debian, there is this thing where people still to this day upload manually binary blobs into the registry that people then eventually download. In my opinion, that's not really secure. I cannot validate where that came from. In this case, I can. Then, there's Nix as the operating system, right? I just talked about Nix as a package manager, Nix as a language, in the sense that how we use the language to define packages. And now, the operating system is nothing more, funnily enough, than another package within Nix packages. It really sounds stupid, but it really is. Because if you think about it, well, what's an operating system? What is Linux? Well, we take source code, right? That being the Linux source code. We apply some build steps to it, and we get a binary that we just happen to run. So Nix sees the operating system, being Linux, as nothing more but a package. But it goes a step further, and it gives you a nice interface to also configure that operating system. So instead of just building Linux and then imperatively on top of that start building, no, we can actually define what we want ahead of time. I'll show you my own horrible config in a little bit. But in this example, we are simply defining a user called Bryan. We say it's a normal user. Yes, we don't want it to be a system user, for example. We define where its home is at, its description, the groups that he should be in, and the OpenSSH security keys. When I now call NixOS build, it actually is going to build this thing. If I then change something, call it again, it builds it. As somebody in the embedded field that did a lot of kernel patches, right? It's very nice to be able to do this. It's very nice to be able to say like, hey, I just want these patches.
And removing user is as simple as removing this, and no trace of that user will ever be left.
Exactly. That's also true. It's also very true is once we remove this, Nix will actually make sure that everything that it ever referred to is just wiped, basically. But of course, it isn't only limited to defining users and all of your system administration, but also just making sure that services are configured correctly. In this case, I just took some Prometheus exporter nodes, so this will enable it. Define a port, etc. You get the gist, right? For everybody that ever used Puppet or Ansible, this seems logical, right? But the way it works inherently is different. Where Puppet and Ansible will actually already have some, it needs infrastructure set up for it to work. With Nix, it's like compiling software. Valentin, a colleague of mine at Tweak, came to this conclusion of like, Nix is really looking at software packaging as programming, right? With programming, you also write source code, you compile it, you get output. And with Nix, with the packaging part and also the operating system part, you just write some config, you compile that config, and you get something you can run. What you can run, that be a program or an entire operating system, Nix doesn't care about. Am I going too fast? Is that clear?
Maybe I can just out of curiosity.
Sure.
Like if it's any package, let's say TLP, if you have a laptop and you want to do some optimization, do the Nix packages and expose these settings to be able for you to set that up ahead of time? And for example, NixOS.
I don't think NixOS itself, there's NixOS hardware, right?
I think the point here is that there's a very clear separation with Nix between a package, which
Yep.
is just a dumb set of binaries, and the settings, which are usually kind of modules.
Yeah, modules, yeah.
There's a very clear separation. A package is not a service. If you want to set up a service, you will describe it in your configuration, but you don't just install a package to get the service running.
I'll show you my own
Separation
config in a
is
minute.
lot different than relevant.
I'll show you my own config in a minute. It's going to be horrible, but it's what a beginner would do. So we have Nix as language, Nix as an operating system, and then in my opinion the most important part, Nix the package set, which is quite huge. I always like to pull up this graph from Apology. Why? Because, well, if you look at the AURs over here, so like this is the number of packages and then the freshness meaning like how up to date they are basically. A number of packages, well, yeah, how many unique packages there are in that repository. The AUR is doing pretty good, but then you look at Nix stable. So this isn't even our own stable, right? This is 22.05, which is already pretty old actually. Unstable is right over there in the very top right. So if you decide to use Nix packages unstable, which I do not recommend unless you do want to compile things from source from time to time, but if you decide to do it, you will have, or are pretty much guaranteed to have, the biggest number of packages available to you, as well as them being very up to date. Why is that? Nix packages is nothing more than a GitHub repository, which also allows us to do a lot of these cool CI/CD and automated updates to the entire thing. I can actually show that because I have internet, which is a luxury. But like you see, we already have 469,000 plus commits. There are hundreds, if not thousands of commits each day of just packages being added, packages being updated. I myself packaged the Grafana Mimir package into Nix packages half a year ago, maybe a year ago by now. Ever since then, I never touched it again because a bot just took over. There is now a bot that's just like...
That's also a direct result of having things like, we're quite strict about having the version stability defined, and then like everything that uses the fetch from GitHub function, that's a very simple prototype of that function, so it's very easy for just to replace the value of the version in there and update the hash. And if there's nothing changed about how the package is built, that's all that's needed to update the thing. So yeah, we've done also that for us.
So the only manual intervention is if any of the build steps change?
Yes.
Yep, exactly. So if a developer decides to switch build tool, then yeah, of course we'll have to change.
Or if the tests fail because the package is now built and they're also tested.
Yes.
That also happens, yeah. Yes?
What do you use as bots?
Sorry?
What do you use as bots? Where are they running?
I think so.
Ryan, yeah. Ryan wrote his own bot. I can see, because chances are very high if I go look in the commit history that I see it. Where is it? There it is. So somebody decided to write a bot, Ryan. I keep forgetting his last name, but yeah, Ryan decided at a certain point, I'm going to write a bot. It's also pretty funny if you look at like the commit graph, right? You see Ryan make a shit ton of commits at a certain point, and then just nothing anymore, and then the bot takes over. So Ryan got sick and tired of updating packages, I assume.
And that's just running on his own internal infrastructure?
I actually don't know.
Yeah.
Most likely, but I don't know.
I believe the sources.
Sources are open source, yeah. Yeah, the bot is open source, that I know, but...
then does the bot create pull requests that have to be...
So every time the Grafana Mimir package, for example, gets updated, I get pinged as well, because we have this nice maintainers list as well, which I am in somewhere, which is, haha, Nix expression, if it loads, because it's huge. But yeah, there's just like, we keep a record of who the maintainers are, and I get pinged every time that Mimir is updated. I'm in there somewhere, I have no idea where. You as well, let us know. Yeah.
It probably looks up to be.
There's Elvis. There we go. So, but yeah, we keep a record of who's maintaining certain packages within Nix packages, and the bot then pings them. More often than not, I'm like, looks good to me, thumbs up, and then it merges it. So.
GitHub ideas were a good idea because I changed my nickname after I added it.
But yeah. Again, I'd show you Mimir, but I honestly forgot where it is. Actually, we can go to the pull request and just search for it, right?
And then self-load and then go to scroll package stores.
That's also true. But here's, for example, an example of what the bot does. It just, I did these things, I did some checks, and then it's either me or Happy Sala that it just like goes, that looks good to me, and if it looks good to us, then it gets merged. Great community, in my opinion. So slides will be shared, right, Elvis?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's nixos.org/community, which is like a discourse forum. No, sorry, discourse.nixos. It's just a page of showing the different teams and the different places where you can ask for help, basically. There's a discourse forum, there's a matrix, and there's also a Discord server. There's many places where you can ask for help. Also, if you ever find a Nixer in the wild, they are more than enthusiastic, more often than not, to explain you what Nix is. Do just bug them, right? Ask them things, ask them how things work, etc. Also ask me things, how it works. We are starting more and more to also organize more conferences, try to be a bit more visible, try to do more talks like these with amazing people, quite honestly. So keep an eye out for local opportunities to also meet up with them near you. And thank you for listening. If there's any questions, I'll take them now. And otherwise, I do still have, there's nix.dev if you want to learn it, which in my opinion is my most favorite one. Why? Because it has pretty well documented tutorials of how to do basic things that you might want to do with Nix. That's a pretty nice one. Yes?
Is it the future to have Nix or other sort of immutable systems like with the desktops, with a main computer?
Yeah. So on my machine right now, I am running NixOS, right? I have tinkered with Fedora Silverblue in the past, which also applies some of the concepts. Of course, I cannot predict the future, sadly enough. But yeah, if you ask me, I do believe that immutability plays a very important role in the future of computing in general, right? Why? Just a very practical example. If this laptop breaks, my config is somewhere in GitHub, I get a new laptop and there's very minimal config that I have to edit to get that entire system running again. For DevOps people, right, that are managing large infrastructure, that's also very nice, right? If your servers go down and you can press a button, go grab a coffee, come back, and 20 minutes later, your infrastructure is just redeployed as if it was never gone. It's a very nice tool to have, right? And if it can do that in a simplistic and elegant way, that's just an added bonus. Nix, in my opinion, of course, does it in a simple and elegant way, where with Fedora Silverblue, I like the experience, but I disagree with certain parts of it.
Backup with data, it's not so difficult?
No, actually it becomes easier because with Nix, there's a lot that you can just generate, right? There's a lot that you don't have to back it up, right? There's a lot of data that you can just, like the config, you can put it on GitHub with the entire Nix config and have a very high likelihood that you can reproduce it, right? Like re-instantiate it somewhere else. The backups actually, because for example with, good example, my mail client right now, right? So I'm using Emacs again with mu4e. And mu4e, like the data directory, I set up, again, defined it in Nix, how to back up that little directory. But I had to define in Nix where that directory lives. So building the script and to back it up with Borg, no. Borg, yeah. I just, with Borg, yeah, Borg backup, yeah. I just basically told it like, yeah, there's a directory, and configured that in Nix again, and it just knows where to find it and how to back it up.
It can be possible to have, for example, Belgian EID software and graphical GUI applications to an average user, or is it maybe too high?
So at this moment in time, I'd say.
I'm actually the maintainer of the Belgian EID software on NixOS, and it works. It works very well.
That we don't advertise it well enough.
It's there, it works. You can add it to your system config. And
okay, cool.
Add it to Firefox, and like I use it.
Okay.
All this stuff.
Well, that exists.
This cartridge.
Okay.
It all works.
Okay. But yeah, so at this moment, as The onboarding process at this moment is too difficult in my opinion, not because the software doesn't exist, but because we just don't point into those directions. And we are aware of this, we are working on this, but it has become kind of a larger discussion, right? We started a very small discussion, okay, how are we going to onboard people? And it evolved into this discussion of, okay, not only how do we onboard people, but how do we make sure that people understand what we're trying to, get them on, right? So, yes, they do exist. I'm not aware of all of them. At this moment, at least from my experience, when I started using, there was a steep learning curve, but once that learning curve was, climbed, so to speak, it just flattened out and it stayed flat, which is very nice.
You're at the right point there. I've been using Nix for almost 2 years, and I didn't really know about Nix.dev. So, which resources should we not look at anymore, if there are any, and which should we look at? Because I didn't even know about this one. I often go to the Nix wiki.
Yeah.
Is that a good place to go?
Yeah. So, Nix.dev. I'm going to say you which ones I like personally. It would be troublesome for me to say that anything isn't good, right? Because everything the community produces, all kinds of blog posts, all kinds of learning tutorials, I really enjoy them popping up. It's our job as like the marketing team that I'm part of to figure out, how are we going to rearrange them and put them together. Also together with the documentation team, make sure that, all of these things flow. Currently, the flow is this, right? We'd like the flow to become more even and easier to roll into. Nix.dev, definitely one that I do recommend. Just the learning page in general, especially if you're more interested in Nix itself, the Nix manual, I do quite enjoy. Nix packages, if you are planning on packaging something, you can look here, but I've had more luck honestly just going to Nix packages and finding an already existing piece of software and how it was packaged, right? If you want to know more about utility functions, that's a great place.
It's still a good reference.
It's still a good reference, yeah.
It's not how to do.
Yeah, exactly. The NixOS manual, again, good reference, especially if you're installing the damn thing. Then it's good.
I would just say that the command line interface means the stable one has been around quite a long time, so all the resources that use that, they still work. The only disadvantage that they have, they don't have the advantage of a few years of other manuals that they could have learned from. But aside from that, the old ones are still really good.
Actually, you bring up an interesting point in that there is already a lot of documentation, and because of how Nix works, that documentation it's very difficult to get documentation out of date with a Nix. So chances are high that if you find documentation, you can just try it out. The next hour.
Sometimes I run into this module sensor for Nix websites have changed, but then you have to read the change log.
And even today, sometimes when modules change, it even tells you like, hey, you could try this.
Yeah,
so that's also pretty nice. They've gotten better. If you want a more interactive form, there's the Nix Hour from my employer Tweak. Sylvan organizes these every week or every bi-weekly. I'm not sure, there was a recent discussion about that, but it happens pretty often. They're live streamed. You can just hop into the live stream, ask your questions, and Sylvan he'll either answer it very shortly or go down in a rabbit hole. It's one or the two. But Sylvan's a great guy. He's very friendly, so do ask him questions. That's why he organizes these things. Zero to Nix from Determinate Systems recently came out. I do understand why they did it. I do like it, although I find the navigation again a bit difficult. What I do like is that they clearly say the different components of Nix, so that's very nice. Another great documentation. Of course, I wouldn't be allowed to stand here if I didn't promote my employer. No, Tweak, also we make blog posts on Nix. We ask questions of like, what is Nix? How do we actually use it? We do some use case studies, etc. And we post about these things pretty often. One of my colleagues, Alexander, recently did a piece on OPAM Nix. Of, if you use OCaml, you can now use OPAM Nix to Nixify, like he says, your OCaml projects. They're very well written because it's not one set of eyes, but all sets of eyes within Tweak that look at these. Of course, the experimental Python bindings, and then there's also, which I forgot, just the search function, which saved my ass many times. I could have indeed just typed in Mimir over here, found the Mimir package, go to the homepage of Mimir, which will go to the GitHub repository in this case. And I can also just go to the source, which doesn't go to the source of the package, but the Nix packages source. There's the same interface for NixOS. So if you are wondering, are there NixOS modules like they're called for Mimir? Yes, there are. These are very basic in the sense that it's just enabling configuration and figure it out yourself. There are more elaborate ones that are easier to configure and help really hold your hand. Yes?
So just to clarify, what is the difference again between a module and a package?
So a package is literally just like you get some sources. It can be a lot of things, but in its most basic form is you get some sources, you apply some build steps to it, and you get some binary, right? Modules are more of a way of declaring, how certain things will happen eventually. That's how I look at them. They're composable components of your system. For example, your NixOS, the thing that you built, the NixOS built, that's an actual package eventually, right? But the way that you compose that package is through modules.
It's more like runtime states.
More like runtime states, yeah.
If your package needs a config file in /etc, a module would actually build that config file in the settings.
Also,
And that gives you this nice exposure on NixOS modules. You can say SSH enable, great. It doesn't necessarily make the SSH a server package, but it will configure SSH, and you can add options to it. So it will have an option for the port, for example. You can change the port. So that's what
Actually,
and also, it's the actual thing that causes the SSH daemon to actually be started.
Yeah.
It will also.
So if you could write the configuration ahead of time through the package system, the package could have a configuration file in that. But
So-
then you still have to run it.
to give you an example from my config, this is in a flake. What is a flake? It's a set of inputs of where you're pulling sources from, and a set of outputs. One of these outputs being my system configuration. It's dirty. I know there's better ways to do this. People have told me a million times already. This is what makes sense to me, right? But the nice thing is, it makes it very clear what a module is, right? So NixOS configuration.tweakx1 is kind of a package. It's a special kind of package, but a package nonetheless, right? But it's composed of modules. What are these modules? Well, one of them is Nix packages itself. I just do some overlays over that thing, and yes, I do use unfree software. I'm terribly sorry. But also, for example, there is this other repository called NixOS hardware. As the name implies, it just has some pre-defined configurations for certain laptops and other hardware things in general. Again, I input that as a module. Then there is the actual configuration that I host myself, which is also an NixOS module. So all the users that I want, the SSH config that I want, the Emacs clients, etc., the Emacs servers, etc., are all defined over here. This over here is because I run a weird kind of setup. Home manager is, well, as it says, it manages my user's home directory. That's another NixOS module. So modules are really just in my view at least, a way of composing the NixOS package. But it's, for example, the OpenSSH one, what it actually tells you is, well, you have a certain kind of parameters, right, to control how OpenSSH will function eventually, configure it, right? And then it also defines in another part of, thank you, Siri. In another part, it will actually start defining like how it should run it, right? One part is like, how do you configure it? And the other part is, well, how will systemd eventually start it up, and where will it save state and actually start doing this? This also comes back to the thing, your NixOS system is built into the Nix store. So we built that into the Nix store, and then we activate it. And that activation step is where all of this entire list of modules will get run through and actually be activated.
So that's why the runtime states.
Yeah, exactly.
Hardware compatibility with the new hardware, with like printers.
Pretty well. That's why I allow unfree for like newer things that have unfree drivers. I do allow unfree, so pretty well. There's also a project out there, if you're very into like the free software, geeks, that is very much more drilled down, like not drilled down, like locked down, right? That just forces you to use free software, which is admirable. With Nix packages, by default, we disallow it. But again, allowing it is literally setting a flag to allow unfree to true, and all of a sudden you have access to a lot of unfree software that has been packaged within Nix packages. And with new hardware, I mean, this laptop is from 2021, so it's okay. Yes?
Can you use it instead of homebrew? And if yes, how good does it support?
So the macOS support from what I've heard, because I've never really been able to try it out myself, is okay. It's not the best, but it's definitely okay. Yes, you can use it as a homebrew replacement. You can even use it in tandem with each other, right? Because Nix doesn't mess around with that part of the system. Also, if you just want to give it a shot, Determinate System actually made, in my opinion, a good installer. Systems, Nix installer.
I think there's a specific Nix, I think it's a Discord, matrix channel.
Yeah, exactly, as well.
Home manager, definitely, and I think even about macOS as well.
Yeah, there's Darwin.
Yeah. A nice thing with, if you want to try it out and see if Nix fits your use case on macOS, I know that this one works a bit better on macOS, the Determinate System installer. Also, it's very easy to uninstall. So if you install Nix and you're like, yeah, this is not for me, you can just install it later down the road.
Plenty of reason to use that one.
Yeah.
I have another question. How suppose that you want to install it on the VM, so you go to DigitalOcean or Amazon or whatever. How do you install it? Free images or?
Some, Gandhi recently, I think, has support for NixOS, but most don't. But we do something really dirty called NixOS Infect. We can actually kind of like infect systems. DigitalOcean, you said, right? Oh, did not want to do
I
that?
think there's some more people keep working on scripts on installing NixOS.
Yeah.
I have a few on Linode, and
So yeah,
we made an image.
we abuse the fact that a lot of these cloud vendors have cloud config, right? And we just override the entire system. So you install an Ubuntu, and then after a while it becomes an NixOS VM. A nice thing as well with NixOS, there are these. If I want to test out my system, right, without actually switching to that configuration, I can ask Nix to not switch my current system into that configuration, but build a VM instead. And I can then boot that through VirtualBox or KVM or whatever you're using, right, and just do it that way. I've also seen that mechanism be used to, eventually just build ISOs, right, and that be shipped over to cloud vendors that way.
And you can pass in a Nix configuration then, so that the system that is built is...
This is a parameter that you can pass into this, yeah. I'm not sure if they do it over here in the example, but you can definitely do that, yeah. Yes?
Do you have experience with creating desktop applications? With packaging desktop applications?
I did more no, not GUI applications, definitely not.
Maybe you could answer that. So a lot of desktop applications heavily use DBus in order to do a whole bunch of things. For example, one of the things is that they use DBus in order to figure out if there's another instance of the same application running.
Yeah.
So Nix, as far as I know, supports running multiple different versions of the same application.
Yeah.
How is that handled on the DBus side, if it is handled on the DBus side?
DBus I'm not familiar with. I know that if you run something in a pure shell, so one has the environment variables clean as well, then sometimes things complain about DBus, and that's about the extent I know about that.
I guess it depends on how the process communicates on DBus that it's running already. Does it use the exact version maybe to signal it? Or does it just say...
It doesn't use the exact version. Most of the time it uses the name of the app. What is it? App image metadata or something? App metadata.
So it's not specific?
Yeah, like
If it uses the
there
version?
will be one DBus session, right?
Yeah.
Running multiple is not something that's really supported. And if two things conflict on that DBus session, they will just conflict. So having multiple versions of GUI applications running,
I know I
all want to have that DBus
know I've had things that...
Yeah, okay.
I know I've had things that have complained from the own instance of this already running.
Yeah.
And they have accepted it, but how they use DBus, that's up to them, that's not...
There's also this fact that if you pull packages from Nix packages, right, it's almost guaranteed that all of these packages will use the same version of DBus. So I'm imagining that you're trying to explain an issue where if two applications use a different library version of DBus to communicate with DBus, right?
Like if they both use the same DBus, the same DBus instance.
Yeah.
But like if, for server applications, a lot of the stuff is all done using files,
Mhm.
and each application gets their own view of the world
Mm-hmm.
based on the file tree that's created for it. But with dbus, if you have a single dbus instance, then this separation isn't complete, and then it can conflict. And I was wondering if NixOS has a solution for that, but it's basically just...
I'm uncertain. I can't.
If you
Yeah.
patch the way the application announces itself,
Yeah.
let's say the programmers made a quote-unquote mistake and they just announced the application on dbus with a very generic name,
Yeah.
without a version.
Yeah.
You could actually patch and build the application again from source and patch it through an override on the package that fixes that problem and makes the version a part of the name, for example.
Yeah.
Then you could run different versions at the same time using the same dbus instance because they would announce themselves differently.
Yeah.
But in that case, I mean, in general, Nix packages makes it very easy to patch things as with kernel
But
packages.
I think your question, it doesn't really prevent anything or has anything in place to prevent those kinds of issues, no?
And how often does Nix packages patch software in order to be able to run within this
The
environment?
release cycle currently is
And we do twice a year.
twice a year, yeah. So twice a year we have like
I mean,
The
So-
percentage.
so when you add a
Mhm.
certain piece of software into Nix,
Mhm.
like what's the percentage of times where you have to add a certain patch to the application in order to make it run within this system?
That really depends. From
There's a
my
very-
packaging experience, none. But from some of my colleagues at Tweak, they'll conflict these things quite often.
Yeah, but there's actually a very generic way that everything gets patched
Yes.
with the ELF. So they,
Yeah.
they patch the load path
Yeah.
so that because there's no shared libraries,
Yeah.
so they're all in the Nix store. So they patch the binary to load it from a different place, and that's a very generic patch that gets applied everywhere, and that actually makes most of the things all
Yeah.
work.
If you look through Nix packages, sometimes you'll find .patch files that just, overwrite a hard-coded path somewhere, for example. That's something that I do encounter, but never have done myself, so to speak.
A lot of the patching is due to, I think it's the package authors, or the upstream authors not doing something that conflicts with how strict we are about
Yeah.
packaging.
And also, then we come back to Nix packages. Nix packages has a very nice utility function for this that makes it very easy to make these patches. So, is it a problem? Yes. Is it a big problem? In my opinion, not.
We try very hard to upstream.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
maintain about 15 packages, and I think 2 of them I had to write manual patches for.
Yeah.
It's not like the patches that you have to write are not difficult. It's just, oh, there's a hard-coded path here, and you can change it to something that is not hard-coded. And yeah, that's it.
That's what it comes down to more often than not. Yeah.
Is it possible to have the Nix architecture not so to change the kernel Linux to BSD, or is it very difficult?
I'd say it's definitely not impossible, but it'd be a humongous effort, because if you look at Nix packages, definitely right now, a lot of these services, or like the NixOS modules, right, they depend on systemd being there. They assume that systemd is a thing. So if you can get systemd running on BSD kernels, sure, but then you still have, I think there was a project a while ago that tried doing this, but I have no clue how far it got. Theory possible, but I have no idea if somebody actually went out and did it.
I think I saw something recently that they got Nix working on FreeBSD.
Yeah.
BSD is not just the packaging.
Yeah,
The packaging, yeah.
No, I didn't get the question. I didn't hear the question very well. So.
It is to have maybe one application and one file. One application in one file and this solution.
Yeah, I mean,
without dependency.
I'm missing something about the question, sorry. It is.
If you could repeat the question real quick.
Is it possible to change the in an easy way have the Nix philosophy or Nix package manager, Nix modules with another kernel?
in the kernel, I would say things, there's Nix Darwin, which is almost, the way I heard it, it's almost an implementation on top of the Darwin system. So just using the Darwin kernel and doing most of what NixOS does on top of what Apple gives you.
So the
macOS system.
it's definitely possible, but I just don't think a lot of people went out and did it. So it's possible, that definitely, but
But can you use Nix on just the package manager?
Yeah.
On BSD?
I have no idea.
Yes.
I know people got it to work, but I've never tried my own.
Exactly.
Yeah. It depends if you mean the package manager or do you mean NixOS as a configuration tool for your whole system. They're different. But you can use Nix, the package manager, to build software on BSD. Because it uses the same idea, it's just build instructions. Get the source, make configure, make install. Yes.
Okay.
Just,
If there's more questions, I think I have to
yeah.
stop. But if there are more questions, I'll be running around. There's apparently other Nixers as well, so just ask questions. But thank you for listening.
Thanks. Thank you.